worldwide, faith-based, community-driven streaming media. This is the Voice 17104.com from the Allison Hill District of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Now broadcasting community radio from Studio A and community television from Studio B on the Voice 17104.com.
Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to the Richard James Show on 17104, The Voice.
Go right ahead, Rich.
God said he's going to wipe my eyes. So many times when I've been made to cry, you know, he said he's going to wipe my eyes. Said he would, said he would, said he would. You know, troubles and heartaches may endure for a night, but one thing I know, he's gonna make it all right. He said he's going to wipe my eyes. Said he would, said he would, said he would. I sang gospel music growing up. There used to be a quartet in Chester called the Mount Eagle Quartet. My dad sang for that group. And I sang for a group called the Harmonizing Echoes. And we were born out of an era of segregation and oppression. Today, I'm going to reach back in history. And I've reached back before. But I'm going to reach back in history and deal with the legacy of the civil rights movement in Chester, Pennsylvania. Civil rights and segregation is a video that I have that I'm going to show you with some interesting material. Now, why am I going to take you folks to Chester, Pennsylvania? Well, Chester, Pennsylvania, and I'll say it and I'll say it again. First of all, it is the oldest city in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It was formerly a capital of the Commonwealth. It was one of the places where William Penn landed. And prior to William Penn, the Swedes were the first to develop Chester. Chester was once called Upland. But I want to talk to you about the civil rights struggle. And there's some things that you may not know about Chester. First of all, during the period of the 60s, Chester was once the hub of the civil rights movement. People from all over the nation that were involved in the structure of civil rights were involved in Chester, and they came to Chester. Just to give you a little bit more history, and some of the information that you will receive will be from the video. But when I was in Chester, the only integrated school that existed was the high school, and it hadn't been integrated for that long. The elementary, what they call junior high school or middle schools were all segregated. Now, segregation doesn't seem that bad, but the terrible thing about segregation and separation is that we had the worst of everything. Now, I attended Booker Talifer Washington Elementary School. And right across the street from Booker Talifer Washington Elementary School was Frederick Douglass Middle School. And one time, years and years before my time, Frederick Douglass was the black high school. And that's when segregation was clear and that even the high school was segregated at that point. But the problem is that all we received in our black schools were hand-me-downs. We received nothing but hand-me-downs. We got the worst of everything. Our band got the old thrown away instruments. Our football team had thrown away jersey. And the education that we received At some time, at some point, some of it wasn't too bad, but our teachers didn't have the kind of resources that even the white teachers had. So we had to do what we had to do with what we had to do it with to survive. Now, I'm not going to kid you. I had some good teachers now. My counselor, Emma Brinkley, who later became the principal of Douglas, was a woman who encouraged me when I was young to go to school and go back to school and go to college and to make something out of my life. She was a wonderful, wonderful woman. I'll never forget Emma Brinkley. She was absolutely adorable. But Chester was segregated. Chester was denied resources that other people had. Chester had a police force that was brutal and nasty. And we had one nasty black cop, we call him Officer Kinlaw, that didn't mind beating up on black folks. They talk about today police brutality and need for police training and police reform. Well, we had some horrible, horrible, horrible folks on the police force in Chester at that time. We had some brutal, nasty, badly trained cops. Now, I'm just going to say this. There were some good police officers also, even at that time, who were not as nasty and as brutal as some of the white racist cops that they had on there. They had a man called Hamilton, who was a wonderful, wonderful guy, who loved people and loved students and people of color and people who weren't colored. He loved everything. He was a great guy. So I'm not going to condemn the entire police force, but I'm saying that it was brutal at times. Civil rights movement in Chester, because of the segregation, because of the discrimination that existed, we had to set up a civil rights movement. And our civil rights movement was there to deal with those issues. Now, Chester, at one point, had over 63,000 people. And during the age of the 60s, particularly the early 60s, about 40% of those folks were Black. And Chester was harshly and brutally segregated, very, very, very segregated. So we established a movement to deal with segregation. And then looking at the history of Chester and our civil rights struggle, some of the research that existed on that movement was available in Historical Society. George Raymond, who was a laborer, kept meticulous journals and notes on the history of the civil rights movement in Chester. And some of the things that he wrote were lifted up and were archived and saved. And that's some of the information that they received on in the research that they did for this video. So I'm just giving you some of the things that are there. We're going to look at this video, look at some of it, and then we're going to go back. One thing that I didn't like is that they didn't give enough individuals, they didn't give enough credit to all the people who actually did the work. And so we're going to look at the video and see what they have to say, and then I'll be back to give you some of the information. Okay.
You've got to restock the shelves out there, buddy.
That's great. Wow.
One thing I love about Chris is that, you know, he wrote this book on Chester. Nobody knew who he was. Most of us didn't even know he was writing a book. The book kind of snuck up on us. But the beauty is he has not finished his work with this book. As he pokes around Chester, he kind of often continues many of the topics that he talks about from just hanging out with people like us and hearing our stories. So the storytelling project that he's talking about is really going to be the continuation to what I hope is part 2 of this book as he continues on. But that's enough with you, Chris. I got to move this thing on to Jordan Smith. Professor Jordan Smith from Widener University He's going to present a timeline of events during 1963, 1964 with the slideshow. So let's go. Let's get our popcorn out and see what Dr. Smith has for us.
All right, I'm going to make you listen to me before I show the slideshow for a bit.
But that's our pleasure.
Kind of following up on what Chris said, it's a strange feeling to be presenting on kind of the protests themselves on this panel, because I'm the person who hasn't written a book on it and did not live through the events. But what I think I can bring to the table is my vocation as a historian. And what that means in this context is finding and reading records of this event, evaluating the evidence, reconstructing what happened, and reflecting on what all of it means. So in the next 15, but I have to apologize to our organizers, it's probably gonna be more like 20 minutes. I'm gonna go through kind of those different points. What follows does not purport to be the history of the Chester protests, but a history of Chester protests. And I think that's important because different people have had kind of different experiences with that. And I think it's really important for us to kind of value those experiences, to bring in oral histories, to kind of collect these stories. That's something that I think everybody on the panel is interested in doing in different ways. But I will say a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is coming from kind of archival records that I've worked on pulling together. So Chris gave you a sense of the state of the civil rights movement in Chester prior to 1964. I want to kind of go into a little bit more detail about what Chester was like at that point. I think that can give us a jumping off point. It was a city of 63,000 people undergoing profound changes like many cities that had prospered during the wartime years. White flight was in full force. The white population had decreased about 15% in the previous 2 decades, and African Americans now made up 40% of the population of Chester. Poverty was creeping in. 50% of families were making less than $4,000 per year. Relatedly, the average adult in Chester had completed fewer than 9 years of schooling. The average in Delaware County as a whole was 12. The schools were shaped by these dynamics. There were 11,000 students, 60% of whom were African American. Because of those hard-fought earlier victories, the high school had been fully integrated. There were 11 elementary schools, 3 of which only taught African American students, 2 more of which were almost all African American students. Those schools tended to be in older buildings, were overcrowded, and only 1 of the 5 had a kindergarten. Chris's presentation reminds us that these were not new concerns, but the urgency shifted in the 1960s. And there are 2 reasons for that, one local and one kind of more national, I would suggest. Locally, people became impatient. Stanley Branch, who split off from the NAACP and formed the Committee for Freedom Now, embodied this new urgency. He stated in an interview in early 1964, quote, "We are going to be free and we are going to be free now. We're not concerned with what's going to happen in 68, 69, or 70, end quote. This new sense of urgency was not necessarily compatible with long drawn out negotiations with the school board or county or city committees. And I would add too that Branch is associated with this immediatism, but the movement really was bigger than one personality. At its core, it was grassroots. It engaged mothers of elementary school students, families, certain religious communities, and the students themselves. In some ways, I think it has sometimes been described as Branch being the match that lit the powder keg. Nationally, similar movements were taking hold too. It seems that inspiration for what happened in Chester may have come from an eerily similar school protest in New Rochelle, New York, 3 years earlier. And really the points of comparison are striking. It was kind of a mixed race school district where African-American students were sent to crumbling schools. Families began kind of their more direct action by boycotting schools like they did in Chester. And if Chester would ultimately be dubbed the Birmingham of the North, New Rochelle had already been known as the Little Rock of the North. And as an aside, these nicknames were used to kind of try to shape public opinion kind of on the side of protesters convince kind of Northerners who might not have really been looking at school segregation in their own communities that the protesters were on the side of kind of these movements that many Northerners were more likely to kind of get behind. So anyways, a lawsuit coming out of New Rochelle gave parents of school children a glimmer of hope. A federal judge ruled that purportedly race-neutral school boundaries reinforced segregation and thus needed to be redrawn. The ruling was affirmed on appeal, and the New Rochelle school in question was shut down in 1963, right? An important year in the story that we're telling as well. So activists could look at many other cities and say something similar, and it seems that that is in some ways what activists in Chester said. In joining this fight, they made school segregation, which at least legally had often been a Southern issue, into a national issue. And so protests in the fall of 1963 centered on the Franklin Elementary School on Concord Ave between 3rd and 4th. The school had been built for 500 students, but was now serving 1,200 students. There were an average of 39 students per class, inadequate toilet facilities. The library consisted of a desk with a few piles of books, and the old coal bin was being used as the gymnasium. Okay, I'm going to try to start to share my screen here. Somebody can kind of interject if you can't see my screen. But again, these issues have been brought up to the school board and to other kind of city officials previously. We start to see a rise in tensions in November of 1963. On November 9th, parents of school children organized a school boycott. And this is something I want us to think a little bit more about. For this sort of direct action to work, it requires a critical mass of parents, and at least in the household I grew up in, mothers, to sign off. Those parents and students also picketed outside of the school. On November 12th, the Committee for Freedom Now continued to tighten the thumb screws on school officials, blockading the doors of the Franklin School. On the 12th and 13th, a total of 230 people were arrested at the school and the municipal building. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing my slides here. Sorry. 1 second. Okay. So again, 230 people were arrested on the 12th and 13th of November. And ultimately, Branch and Mayor Ayer reached a truce. The city agreed to transfer some students to alleviate overcrowding and make some improvements. And they also agreed to drop charges against the protesters. The tumult continued in early 1964. And I would say that the city's response became less conciliatory with the inauguration of Mayor Gorby. Protests continued over the gerrymandering of elementary school boundaries and the segregation of teachers. That is, that African-American teachers taught in African-American schools. Another round of school boycotts in February led to 55% absence rates in affected schools. In March, the Chester Human Relations Commission advised integrating the elementary schools the following fall. However, the school board refused. They claimed that any racial bias was legal because it was unintentional and based on where people naturally lived in the city. And they also refused to meet kind of solely with the civil rights groups at work in the city. In light of these developments, members of the Committee for Freedom Now, the NAACP, and the Philadelphia branch of the Congress on Racial Equality joined in protests. Those taking to the streets initially tended to be young, in their teens and 20s, largely residents of Chester, but also local college students from Cheyney State, the Pennsylvania Military College, which is now Widener, and Swarthmore College. Certain religious communities also were involved in organizing this movement. Again, one big takeaway is that the strength of this movement was its people. Now, escalation began during Holy Week of 1964. There was a large rally of between 100 and 300 on the evening of March 27th. This crowd blocked traffic late in the evening at 5th and Market Streets. And in kind of a harbinger of things to come, there were 3 arrests associated with people blocking traffic. Gorby made it very clear in his actions that he was going to arrest people if they impeded traffic. The following day, on March 28th, and we'll just kind of look quickly on the map, this one happened at 7th and Edgemont. But the following day, 30 to 35 people in their 20s or younger held an organized sit-in at 7th and Edgemont. Here are some of these great photographs. They'd been trained to go limp when city and state police tried to remove them. So we got some more images here as well. This is one of the many places where the accounts of police and protesters diverged. It's possible that 1 or 2 protesters abandoned some nonviolent techniques, but that's absolutely not a sure thing. What we do know is that going limp infuriated the police. The Delaware County Daily Times reported the next day that club-swinging police halted a racial sit-down at the busiest intersection in this city this afternoon. The police openly beat protesters, including a 22-year-old Chester resident and recent PMC grad named Walter Bryant. They kind of hit them in the streets and allegedly as they dragged them to police cars. As protesters languished in jail, a period of near daily protests began. To make up for the shortfall of officers, the city was deputizing other municipal employees as special police. This is another kind of technique that often doesn't end well. The main charges lobbied against these protesters were things such as blocking traffic or entryways to schools, generally being, quote, loud, noisy, and disorderly. That appears repeatedly in these reports. And then on several occasions, throwing stones or bottles at police. Now, with kind of these wide-scale arrests, the protests morphed in some ways. They were still absolutely about school issues. They also came to kind of represent a response to the continued imprisonment of protesters. In Chester, one magistrate judge was handling all of the court appearances. He was not accepting bail expeditiously. He was giving people the runaround in other ways. This resulted in overcrowded and inhumane conditions in the jail. And protesters saw this as the city holding people prisoner as a ransom to stop demonstrations. But they would not be deterred. The protests hit another kind of stage in late April. On April 22nd, protests resumed at schools, and protesters got inside schools including Douglas Junior High, Dewey Mann, Watts, and Booker T. Washington. A rally that evening at Temple Baptist Church was held, and there were a series of protests afterwards. The most notable, kind of for what we're going to be talking about, was at the mansion of Republican machine leader George McClure, which was located right up here on Providence Avenue near the Widener campus. By 10 p.m., 300 people had congregated there. They were singing freedom songs, chanting, and clapping. You can see again a relatively young crowd, male and female, largely African American. Again, kind of protesting. Because of the size of the crowd, they were spilling off of the sidewalks, and there had, which the police classified as trespass. And there had also been some property damage reported earlier in the evening. But police kind of brought in city buses and began rather aggressively mass arrests. And somewhere around 120 people kind of were arrested. A reporter for the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin named Timothy Tyler suffered a broken nose and lacerations and was subsequently arrested. He was initially denied medical attention. The state report commissioned in the aftermath noted, quote, grave suspicions are created, however, when authorities appear to fear the eyes of the press. It's something for us to kind of keep in mind as well. As those arrests transpired, action shifted to the police station later that evening. And the event kind of descended into something close to pandemonium when city lights went out on certain streets around the police station. Some protesters were hurling bottles and rocks at police. Police were, of course, swinging nightsticks indiscriminately, hitting both kind of people exercising a peaceful right to protest, people who might have been throwing objects at police, and also people just trying to observe what was going on. The police chased protesters. There are claims and reports of police yelling, "Run, N-word, run," as they swung. 2 days later, the protest refocused in African-American neighborhoods. Many of the leaders of the protests had been arrested and remained in jail at this point, which led to some organizational efforts. But that day, protesters blocked traffic at 3rd and Pusey. The police responded and were hit with bottles and stones, some showering down from overlooking windows and roofs. The police began chasing after their assailants in an undisciplined manner, and non-protesters were kind of increasingly getting caught in the crossfire. There are additional accusations that police were hitting handcuffed prisoners on a bus used to transport them. And the police also charged into a bar called the Bull Moose, and patrons uninvolved in the protests were hit by club-wielding police officers. All told, kind of this was the high watermark in some ways of a series of protests which led to 600 arrests and 40 injuries. I'm gonna, with that, those are kind of the images we have, so I'm gonna end my screen share. This kind of gives us a chance to kind of pause and ask what kind of was accomplished with these protests. The sustained involvement from community members kept the attention of the local and national press on the issues being discussed. It meant that accusations of police brutality were investigated. The Governor's Commission report, which I've quoted from several times today, was ultimately fairly measured, if conservative, in its analysis. For instance, it reserved judgment whenever there were conflicting reports, and it criticized some nonviolent techniques used by protesters. Nonetheless, this report noted breakdowns in police leadership and training. It cataloged aggressive policing techniques, and it identified several instances of outright police brutality. No major police reforms followed, as far as I can tell. I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong. But it's possible, and I would say likely, that this report itself shielded protesters from some adverse outcomes, including prosecution. 2 days later, the Pennsylvania governor, William Scranton, agreed to hold hearings into de facto segregation in Chester as well. The Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission began hearings on May 4th at Pennsylvania Military College. Right, so we see kind of the speed kind of picks up in kind of how issues are being addressed. That November, 1 year after these protests began, or kind of hit another level, the Human Relations Commission ruled that Chester School District was guilty of discriminatory practices. They stated that the district needed to immediately open kindergartens in all of the affected schools and desegregate the schools prior to the start of the 1965 school year. It took 3 more years until the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that the Human Relations Commission had the authority to compel this desegregation. But within 1 week of that ruling, the school board agreed to eliminate or substantially reduce the racial imbalance. However, the process remained, and in some ways remains, incomplete. It took 4 more years until criminal charges against the protesters were thrown out in 1971. So I want to end, and I know I'm way over time, with 3 takeaways that I want us to think a little bit about. The first is that events in Chester were part of an important movement to nationalize the civil rights movement. And this public battle used both direct pressure and the courts to expose and redress discrimination nationwide. The second thing is that the movement's strength came from the individuals who participated in it. They made decisions based off of personal experiences and their own views of what a better, more just society would look like. And the third thing is an important one as well, that the protests were effective. Sustained protests drew attention from the press and forced major investigations into police brutality and segregation in the schools. Progress remained slower than many wanted, but direct action moved the needle in ways that the school district had previously resisted.
Is that another hard stop?
That is.
Oh, okay. Oh my God, that was fascinating.
Hey, yeah. All right. We'll come back to the video a little later, but you got some general information on segregation and the civil rights movement in the city of Chester. That demonstration there at 7th and Edgemont, I participated in along with the others. And at that time, I was beaten by the police and sustained a skull fracture, and then was not sent to a hospital, but was thrown in prison, Broad Meadows Prison, with the rest of individuals. This struggle was extremely important. It had to do with a quality of life, and it was more than just segregated schools. Let me clarify. We also were kept out of positions. For example, most of the businesses in downtown Chester did not hire any people of color. Spear Brothers was one, Colliers. There were different companies down there that did not hire people of color. And I had an experience in which I had gone to one of the, a company called the Ford Motor Company that was in Chester, eventually left, but was there then, and asked to be hired at the Ford Motor Company. And I was told very clearly that we don't hire your kind down here. So there was a serious problem. Now, person who galvanized and pulled folks together for the boycott, two major individuals. That was George Raymond and Stanley Branch. But the person that really started the whole thing and started the demonstrations was Alfreda Charlton. Alfreda Charlton was an 18-year-old, high school graduate, and who became the chairman of the NAACP Youth Council. If you notice in the presentation, the gentleman constantly said that the majority of people within the audience, were young people, and the vast majority of people marching were young people, even though we did have some parents that were there also and that participated in it. There's some other individuals. There was a man by the name of Dr. Felder Rouse. Keep that in mind. Dr. Felder Rice was a medical doctor, was a Black medical doctor. And Dr. Felder Rice was the assistant chairperson of the Committee for Freedom Now. And when the organization broke up, he started an organization called the Chester Civil Rights Organization. But Dr. Felder Rouse was a very important individual in this whole thing. There was another gentleman, there was a bunch of people that were involved. Dr. Orville Eiffel. Dr. Orville Eiffel had a daughter that worked for public broadcasting for many years. She was the main African-American spokesman for that. But Orville Eiffel, who was pastor of AME Church in the city of Chester, and some other ministers, and Reverend Williams. Reverend Williams was the pastor of St. Luke Baptist Church. These ministers wholly and fully supported the civil rights struggle. Now, one minister we had a lot of problems with was a pastor of Calvary Baptist Church, who was tied in with the administration, who had done some good in his day. He was also a mentor of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend Barber. Reverend Barber did not agree with our tactics. He thought we were moving too fast. He refused to let our spokesperson speak in his church and talk about the movement and what they were doing. So we in turn put up a picket line outside of his church and sang a song, "Come by here, my Lord, come by here. Come by here, my Lord, come by here. Come by here, my Lord, come by here. Oh, Lord, come by here. The preachers are Tom's, Lord, come by here. The preachers are Tom's, Lord, come by here. The preachers are Tom's, Lord, come by here. Oh, Lord, come by here." And we marched, and we marched, and we raised up the banner. We had another minister, Reverend Scott, who was also tied into the local power struggle. That mansion they're talking about was the mansion of a guy by the name of John J. McClure. John J. McClure was the leader of the Republican Party in Chester and in Delaware County. Chester, during those days, was basically Republican, conservative Republican. I'm not talking about modern Republicans, because they were modern Republicans that believe in civil rights, but Chester folks were not one of them. Chester was bound to the political system. You had to be a registered Republican or be sponsored by a Republican in order to get a teaching job in the city of Chester back in those days. There were a lot of people that were involved and threw their weight in it. Abdul Shabazz, who was known as Wilbur Johnson, was one of our leaders in our young adult council. Barry Wiley was another one that was a leader, one of the leaders of our council, and who marched and demonstrated with us. We had people like Lewis Brown Jr., whose father was Lewis Brown Sr. and was vice president of the NAACP. Then we had people on a national level that came in and worked with us. And the most noted of which was a man by the name of Malcolm X. Malcolm X came into Chester, I think it was 1964, and he had an organization that he had formed when he left the Nation of Islam. He had an organization that he formed called the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And he also had a mosque he called the Muslim Mosque Incorporated that was in Harlem. So he came down, we had a national conference in Chester, and our key speaker was Malcolm X. And we had other individuals that came to our conference. Brad Rustin was a close ally and a friend who worked very, very closely with us, was there. There was a man we used to call the Mau Mau president of the NAACP, a man by the name of Cecil B. Moore, Esquire. Great man, leader. And during a particular time, Cecil B. Moore was holding demonstrations in front of what was known as Girard College, located up on Girard Avenue in Broad Street in the city of Philadelphia. And Art Fletcher, at the time, was the deputy secretary for the Department of Labor and Industry under the Nixon administration, believe it or not. And because of the work of Cecil B. Moore Esquire, and we, along with Stanley Branch and others, picketed and worked with him, they developed what was known as the Affirmative Action Plan. And that's how the Affirmative Action Plan started. Art Fletcher wrote the first Affirmative Action Plan and presented it to the Nixon administration, and they in turn, at that point, accepted the Affirmative Action Plan. A lot of people. Phil Savage, Tri-State Area Secretary for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He lived out of Baltimore, Maryland. And Phil Savage was with us and marched and demonstrated with us. and did a great job in doing so. So the Chester Civil Rights Movement was ongoing and really worked to accomplish some things and bring about change in Chester. We're going to look at some more of that video, the next section of the video, and there's another presenter who was a school teacher in Chester. So we'll move ahead. Go ahead.
I'm sitting here like biting my nails. You took us through a journey that I'm sure many of us have never experienced. There may be a few out there who have witnessed it. That was compelling. That was earth-shattering. That was revealing. You told a story there. I'm kind of shook up here. I gotta kind of gather myself. I was looking at the timeline and matching it up to my age at that time. So I'm looking at, age 2, age 3, age 4, age 5. And I can share that I didn't know any of that stuff. I mean, that history, of course, the elders, experienced it, but they surely didn't share it. And I don't know how to feel about just learning about much of what you told me, at this stage of the game. But that's the reason why we put this together. We knew this would be a compelling program. We're recording it. We want this history to be shared. You did a phenomenal job, Jordan. I also want to say that the work you do at the university, sharing this history with your students is very unique. You've got that program where you're going to be working, I think, with 3 separate classes in succession, and they're taking a piece of Chester history from these periods and chronicling it and putting it together. Tell us just a little bit about that project and how it works, because this is not the end of Jordan. He's Dr. Smith is on it. Let's go. Tell me what you're doing with the students.
All right, I'll keep it really brief, but I've been kind of working with a class this past fall, which most of the panel came in and talked to my class, which I'm very appreciative of. They're kind of in the process of working on a traveling museum exhibit that could be kind of shown at different kind of places within the Chester community, retelling kind of this story of kind of protest in 1960s Chester or mid-century Chester. There are several kind of manifestations of the project. We're also looking at using kind of technology to tell some of these stories. And we're really interested, the students are in kind of collecting oral histories from community members who'd be willing to share those stories with them. So it's still getting off the ground running. It's very much a student-led effort, but I think there's a lot of history to be told here, and I think we can learn a lot about both kind of the community in which kind of we're all a part of, but also kind of wider kind of trends in U.S. history.
Thank you. Before we move on to our other 2 panelists, someone brought up in the chat that in the photos they saw William Dandridge. And for those of us who know William Dandridge, he has a very distinctive face. It was great to see William Dandridge at such a young age. And there's no surprise that he was on the front line back then. The other thing that was put in the chat, if you missed it, is that all the photos that Dr. Smith showed us are available. They're available from that link. And I think they're all at the Delaware County Historical Society. And finally, you guys sure are chatty. If this was a live event, I'd be shushing all of you right now. But I guess through the power of Zoom, we can chat and ask questions and share information. So make sure you're following the chat, because some really good stuff is coming out of there. All right, now let's move into the part that I'm really excited about. We've got Ms. Twyla Simpkins, we've got Linton Warren. These are people who are going to give us some real life experiences. And in the interest of time, please, Twyla and Len, just keep your remarks to maybe 2 minutes. And I'm going to assign the questions to each of you as I deem appropriate. So for Twyla, do you remember schools being segregated as a child? And were your teachers Black, white, or both?
All right. Both. Let me show my shirt very, very quickly. See pride. And thank everybody who's here, because I saw several people that I invited. My bottom line is that I was like 13 So I went from all black Deweyman to integrated Pulaski. And that admitting people. Yeah. And then I just want to show a couple of things. I want to make sure that Chesterites in particular and anyone that's interested can identify with what's happening. This is a picture of, I don't know if you can see it, glare, but a picture of Malcolm X, Stanley Branch, Gregory, and this was taken. The old it's a Sonic Hall on your street, 3rd North, and it's just a landmark that's disintegrating. And then coincidentally, a friend of mine just sent me this Deweyman Star, which was a newspaper that we put when I was in 6th grade, and it has all black people in it. So again, I went from an all-black school in Deweyman to a very, very white, predominantly white school at Pulaski Middle School. So that's your next question.
Thank you for that. Your audio is just a little bit choppy. I followed it, but if anybody has any questions on what she said, just put it in the chat.
Okay.
Do you recall experiencing segregation outside of the schools, Twyla?
Yes. I was in a unique position where my dad was an alderman, a magistrate. So a lot of people came to our house needing help on a variety of things. And so it was very normal to see any number of people, including dignitaries from the city. And so as this political unrest was happening, there were people coming to my dad asking him to intervene. I just remember in particular, my dad said one morning he called my sister and I to get together, and he said, some things happened today. Your mom will be arrested and lose her job, and your brother's going to be arrested too, because my older brother was out picketing, and my mother, a school teacher, was also out picketing. So as I grew up, I just was made aware of a lot of those things. So kind of being the only one in my class in Pulaski, having to always kind of be on top of things because there was no one who had my back when I was in 7P or whatever that was at Pulaski. So yes, any number of things. And then going to high school was the same thing. Walking through certain neighborhoods, looking at schools and seeing like, why are our schools looking like this when other schools are, are looking different. But we were encouraged to ask questions and think outside the box to try to look for solutions as well. Next. You just kind of messed up my little spiel when you told me I had 2 minutes. So that's why I'm waiting for your questions.
All right, here we go. I lost audio for a moment. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm getting feedback, so hold on here. Oh, it's technicalities.
All right.
Well, while you're just to interject, one of the things I found fascinating too was that I was 13 going to Lackey, and within 8 years, I was a teacher in the Strickland School District. And it was just such a mind-boggling experience trying to figure out how best to serve my young people. And that was my challenge. And 35 plus years later, I decided that I had enough. But I continue to do it in my current capacity, which is to run the old girls' Y and keep it as a repository. And I see that the Historical Society is showing, sharing that they have a lot of documentation. And I just have to throw in that I do too. Mine looks like me. So unfortunately, I could not find a lot of resources. So I started creating my own, saving my own. So just a shameless plug of my little Yes Center. And hopefully my contact information will be included in the as well.
All right. Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Thanks.
Okay.
Linton, it's your turn. Step up to the plate.
We're gonna move ahead. That was a wonderful presentation, a lot of good information. But I want to talk with you about what led up to the whole mass demonstration thing in the city of Chester. Well, first of all, you need to know that Chester during that particular time was totally segregated in terms of housing. And there were areas that you could not move into if you were African American. So therefore, segregation was a way of life there. And one of the things we had in Chester was a market called King Hilo's Market. And there was a guy that owned it called King Jack of Hilo. He happened to be a Jewish gentleman. And it was a segregated market. If you were, they had a skating rink called Great Leopard Skating Rink. And they had a thing they called Ebony Night, which meant that was on, and I was on a Wednesday, that was the only night when people of color were able to skate. So we decided that, hey, we don't like the idea of having a segregated skating rink. Now remember, this is Chester, Pennsylvania, a long way from the Mason-Dixie line. Mason-Dixie line ran between Maryland and Pennsylvania and Delaware. And we were tired of segregation. So what we would do, we joined ourselves with some Swarthmore students, and we would send test cases into them. And when I said I'm talking about the NAACP Youth Council led by Alfreda Chaw. So we would march and in front of the city, but we also would send whites and blacks in. And these whites that were with us most of them were students at Swarthmore College. And so they would go in, and believe it or not, most of them were Jewish also. And they would go in, and the whites would be allowed in, and the blacks would not be allowed in on Wednesday evening. And we picketed and we picketed and picketed. And then one evening when we were out there picketing and demonstrating, a gentleman, light-skinned black gentleman, came up to us and asked us what we were picketing for. That gentleman happened to be by the name of Stanley Branch. And that's how Stanley talked to us, talked to Alfreda, talked to the rest of us, and got an understanding of exactly some of the issues. Now, he had just moved to Chester. He had a brother that lived in Chester initially, but he had just moved to Chester from Philadelphia, where he was involved in work. So that got him started in Chester. So we were not just interested in segregated schools. We were interested in segregated schools and dealing with that issue and dealing with that problem. But we also was interested in employment because Chester, some of the industry, during the World War II, Chester was highly touted as an industrial complex. And we had a shipyard. We had Baldwin Lyman locomotives where we built trains. We had Sun oil refiners. We had a lot of business. And some of those businesses began to close and some began to leave. We also had Boeing, which was right up the road, Boeing aircraft. So we were a highly praised, highly thought of industrial complex. But many of them would not really hire us in any kind of decent position. So we had employment as a problem. So that was a part of our demonstration. Now, when the demonstrations closed down and the city of Chester set up an organization called the Greater Chester Movement. And the titular head of that movement was Stanley Branch. You had other individuals that were involved too, but Stanley was a part of that. And I went to work for the Greater Chester Movement as director of the Curlin Street Community Center. And one of the things, two things that I set up. One was an organization in relationship with SCORE, Small Business Administration, was to help to teach our local African-American entrepreneurs how to run a successful business. I also set relationship up, human resources relationship with some of the major industries, and was able to recruit and gain employment for some of our people. So we had to work on every score. We were a town that was dying, and we were in the process of losing some of the basic industries that were there. And also we saw the problem that some of them, even if they hired us at very low level positions in the city of Chester. And we had, one thing was a lot of support from people of different nationalities. We had a lot of support from local African Americans. And I just wanted to throw out a couple of names of some of the people that I've always, we had the Thomases, for example, Paul and Francis Thomas. Well, Paul worked for the Power and Light Company, and these folks were very, very, very involved with the civil rights struggles. And we did most of it ourselves. I had mentioned Lewis Brown Sr. and Lewis Brown Jr., who were very, very, very much involved. And you've heard the name of people who were here and who worked very, very hard to make this whole thing come about. And we got help, and we reached out for other people to get help. Like national leaders came in. And I'll never forget Gloria Richardson. Gloria Richardson was the head of the civil rights struggle in Cambridge, Maryland. And she came up and she worked with us and helped us to organize. She marched with us, and Gloria Richardson went to jail with us and with that march. She was a great woman. She was one of the founders, I understand, and worked with SNCC, another organization. She was one of the founders of the civil rights struggle, nationally known. A wonderful, 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 wonderful woman you should know about. Another person that you well aware of that spent a couple of years in Chester, and you probably heard me mention this before, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King would come down and be supportive of us. King initially came to Chester as a student. He attended Crozier Theological Seminary, and that's where he got his graduate degree in theology. He initially got his bachelor's degree from Morehouse. And so he left Morehouse and he came to Crozier Theological Seminary. And from there, he went to Boston University and got his doctorate degree. But Chester was close and dear to his heart. He attended Calvary Baptist Church, the pastor being Reverend J. Pius Barber, worked with him, became very close to the family, knew his family very well, but knew people in Chester very well, and consistently and continuously supported us. We had people who were well known and well regarded. I had mentioned earlier Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was born and raised in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And he would come up to Chester, which was only about 17 miles up the road, and participate. He helped us to organize our conference. He was a great planner and organizer. And if you don't know it, Bayard Rustin was working for the Sequin Car Porters, A. Philip Randolph, to be exact, actually was the individual that did all the organizational planning for the March on Washington. He was a great man. He did a great job, and he is well thought of. The people in Westchester will never forget the man, Bayard Rustin. Jim Farmer was another one, Congress of Racial Equality, that came in to support us. And one of the most touching things that I can remember in terms of leaders on a national level that came in and spoke to us was Meg Evers. Meg Evers, I think it was 1963, came to Chester to speak to our civil rights struggle and our movement. And like Dr. King, he preached his eulogy. He said that people were out to kill him, and they probably would. But the movement would move on and the movement would be successful. He was a great man. Medgar Evers was a tri-state area secretary for the National Association of African Colored People. He represented, I think it was in Mississippi, the civil rights struggle there, and the NAACP. So he came to Chester along with many, many others, helped us to get our act together, helped us to organize, helped us to march and to demonstrate and to bring about social change. This video tells me that there's still a major interest of people, young people, in Chester, and that they are doing research. And I hope to contact some of these folks to be able to point them in the right direction so they can also get more information about Chester. And I was blessed that when I came up to Harrisburg back in 1966, one of the religious leaders from Chester, Dr. Orville Eiffel, moved to the Harrisburg area also. In fact, he became the pastor of Monumental AME Church in Stilton. And then I continued to be involved. I was hired by the Tri-County Commission on Economic Opportunity in Harrisburg to be able to continue the work that I had started within the city of Chester. I was blessed in Chester to have been able to do some very, very positive things. And I was even equally blessed in the city of Harrisburg to be able to continue some of those things. And I'm just going to suggest to folks, we do a historical thing every once in a while. And we like to share information. Go to your historical society, find out as much as you can. We are living in some very dire circumstance and dire time. Even though it was hard back in the day, in the 60s, I could never imagine that a group of individuals would attack the capital of the United States and be urged on by the alleged president of the United States. We have a lot of racism, police brutality. We've got to train our police in terms of what to do and how to do it. I want to thank you all for tuning in to the Richard James Show. I hope you've gotten some information that is very interesting and beneficial to you. Again, I want to say to you that we're still down at Lebanon Farmers Market. African Paradise is my business. We're still down there selling African clothing, African art, African oils, and please come down to see us. We're open both Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. We open up at 8 o'clock and close around 5:30, 6 o'clock. Come down and see us. And God bless you. Much love and understanding. And take care. And I want to thank the owner, Mr. Chris Thomas, and his wife and his family for being so supportive of the Richard James Show and what we're trying to do. And thank God that they're doing things within our community, and thank God that they exist, and come and give us your support. God bless, and so long.
Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard James Show. Our African and our African American programs are set up to educate you on what's going on in this world. Thank you for taking out the time to listen. Let's hear from you sometime also. So this is your neighbor and your friend signing off. Until I see you again next week and hear from you again next week. So long. God bless.